Welcome back to the Sex and Gender series. We are down on Roman numeral 3 if you're following the PowerPoint. If not, our topic for this evening is using separation of church and state to control what ideas are allowed to be discussed. So, just a quick review. What we've learned is that the political classes, I'll just call them that, have learned to manipulate the definition of words in order to affect public opinion. They change the definition of words in a variety of ways, but they take control of it. They decide where they want the definitions to go and what they want the definitions to force people to think. We looked at Dr. Money, and we talked about his changing of the use of the word gender, which it originally simply meant a kind. So you have different genders of fruit, you have different genders of cars. That was the original meaning. And of course, we had different kinds of sexes. We had two. So that's where the word links. And we talked about the fact that when they change a word, there's a craft to it. You have to know where you want it to go. And then you have to you have a present definition. And then you have to link it somehow so that when you get down the road, there's some kind of rationale for believing that's the new definition is accurate. And so very easily you can see how gender, meaning kind, which is sometimes used to talk about the two kinds of human beings, males and females, and then eventually was used to have its present meaning, which means which is restricted to sex. Whether you're a male or a female. Anyway, that's the first one. We also talked about the the experiment with the boys and how he tried to prove by a series of experiments on two twin boys that what gender you were, or male or female, was not determined by your DNA, but was determined by your culture, and that is one of the predominant views that are present today, and this started back in the 50s. That's what we've done up until now. So in this section, we want to talk about an avenue where the same group of people used to affect public opinion, what could be discussed, and by restricting what can be discussed, then they're allowed to present their own ideas unchallenged, because to oppose them, you would be violating some other principle, seemingly unrelated. And in this case, it's the use of the idea of the separation of church and state to control in the public arena what can be discussed. And almost everybody goes to public school, so you see they have a large audience in which to speed up the manipulation of the changing of the word, changing of the meaning of the word. So let's look at this real quickly. First of all, in order to discuss it, we need to know what the Constitution actually says, because, of course, the phrase refers to the Constitution of the United States. Article 1 of the Constitution says this, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging," that means shortening, "the freedom of speech or the freedom of the press, or the right of the people to peacefully assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances." So the first thing we'll mention is this does not say schools, it does not say churches, it does not say communities, it doesn't even say states. Now later, I think it's the 14th Amendment will extend these restrictions on the federal government onto the states, but when the Constitution was written, it is only restricting the federal government. Now, what was going on at the time was that you had 13 colonies, and they did not want to give up their freedom to a centralized government. Yet, they needed to bond together in order to protect themselves against Great Britain and other powers. They knew that they would be stronger. If one were invaded, they could be taken out easily, but collectively it would be harder to invade them. So there was a lot of pressure to join, to be strong, and at the same time, each state did not want to give up their liberties to some stranger telling them what to do, or someone from a different culture forcing them to do something that they didn't want to do. So the original meaning of the Constitution was simply to restrict the federal government. Anybody else, no one else was restricted. Your mother could censor anything she wanted. She could tell you to shut up, or whatever. But even communities could get together and have a religious community and restrict who was there, who was in the community. All these things were very prevalent all over the United States. In fact, we had many states had state churches. See, Rhode Island was Baptist. Of course, Baptists are separation of church state anyway. And that's where the doctrine comes from, primarily the Baptist line of theology. And you had the Episcopal Church in Virginia, and you had the Congregational churches in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and these were in effect state governments or theocracies, as some people like to say. Ooh, theocracies. So anyway, that was the original intent of it. Now, another takeoff of this, which is often used, it says, it's called, this phrase, it comes out of Thomas Jefferson's letter, actually. It's called, quote, he uses this phrase, the wall of separation between church and state. And this comes from a famous letter by Thomas Jefferson in 1802, and he was writing to the Danbury Baptist Association. In it, Jefferson declared that when American people adopted the Establishment Clause, they built a, quote, a wall of separation between church and state. Now, this particular letter, the Connecticut Baptists had sent a letter expressing concern over the lack of their state constitution of an explicit protection of religious liberty and against a government of religion. That's where this idea came from. So the phrase "a wall of separation between church and state," because this sounds, I guess it sounds better than simply saying the Congress shall not make a law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So it sounds a little more certain, and Jefferson is trying to allay the fears of the Baptists that they're going to be interfered with on a religious level by their state government. Now, from the time the Constitution was adopted until about 1961, that's a long time, up until 1961, schools across America, almost without exception, read the Bible in the morning and they prayed at the beginning of each school day. I'm not a young man, but even when I was in school in the 1960s, we were praying, and they were reading scriptures in public school all the way up through sixth grade, 1966. So if you ask what did the original meaning of the Constitution, did it apply to schools? Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Clearly, it did not mean you can't pray in public places. It didn't mean that. It's just quite clear, because up until from the 1800s, early 1800s till 1961 is a watershed year because we have a legal case that passes. So just by history and by usage, you see that this really did not apply. No one thought that this applied to public schools or to public employees, because they're citizens too. And if you restrict your employees' speech, it's the same thing as restricting non-public employees' speech. That's clearly the interpretation. And the proof of that is what I just said. All across the country, we were praying and reading the Bible in public schools. Another thing we'll mention before we proceed forward is on July 30th, 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed Law H.R. 619. And this was a bill that required the inscription, "In God We Trust," to appear on all paper and coin currency. Now, why did he do that? Because 1956 is considerably after the Constitution. Well, even back in the 50s, these people we're talking about, the ruling classes, were trying to abolish biblical and really Western civilization, our traditional ideas of right and wrong. They were trying to abolish those from the public arena. And so there was a lot of attacks on religion and the government and this sort of thing from various vantage points. This goes back to 1926 when we have the Scopes trial over the teaching of evolution, and this is all part of the ACLU is one of the main movers at this time for this kind of activity. So it goes even back to 1926. So my point here is simply that why did we pass a law in 1956 that required the inscription of "In God We Trust" to appear on the paper currency? Because we were having this discussion and this public movement to get religion out of the government, so to speak. That's the way they presented it to the public. So as a reaction to this, because many of our leaders were worried that the removal of religion would turn us into a bunch of barbarians, and so in 1956, Dwight Eisenhower signed a bill that required "In God We Trust" to be placed on the money, again as a testimony, and he thought this would help solidify the traditional interpretation of the separation of church and state. So it was in response to the political movement to reinterpret the meaning of Article 1. Now let's go back to about the 1961 era. The dates are approximate here. One of our famous shakers and movers was a lady named Madalyn Murray O'Hair. She was an atheist political activist, and her big push was to ban prayer from public schools and from all government property. This was her main push. And she gave speeches, and they filed lawsuits and all these kinds of things. She eventually was successful in persuading the Supreme Court to rule in favor of this action. And this really, the Christian school I teach in started in 1961 because of this court case. The school that I graduated from, the Christian school I graduated from, also started in 1961 because of this court case. So a lot of the Christian schools that exist today that I'm aware of started because of this particular action. Now, she had two sons. I don't know where the father was. She had two sons that would travel with her, and they would give testimony. William Murray, he testified in the Supreme Court during this case that he was harassed in public school because he was the son of a famous atheist. He was harassed in the public school. Later, he will be converted to Christianity, becomes a Baptist minister, and he basically said in his book, The Life Without God, that he lied in the Supreme Court, that he hadn't been harassed, because we've had atheists around forever, and they've always been quite tolerated. And you can go back to colonial days. Paine and a number of others were kind of overt atheists, and people chided them, but they didn't attack them. Anyway, so and we see this pattern a lot in Roe v. Wade. When that went to the courts to try to force people to do something they didn't vote for, like this, getting rid of prayer in public schools, that wasn't voted for. That was put in by the courts. Something we'd done for 150 years, and nobody said, and no court overruled it, and all of a sudden it's the proper interpretation. So the point is that even in Roe v. Wade, the defendant, I guess that would be Roe. Yeah, I think Roe was the defendant. Anyway, the woman claimed she was raped and that she was denied an abortion, and all this was designed to convince the court to have pity and to allow women to, kill their fetuses. And she also gets converted later. And I saw her in an interview admitting that she perjured herself. She lied. She said she hadn't been raped, that she was coached to say that by the ACLU. So we had the same thing occurring with Madalyn Murray O'Hair, and the same thing occurring in Roe v. Wade. And then just recently with the case of homosexual marriage, where the courts changed the whole definition of marriage without any vote whatsoever. They simply declared that this was a correct thing. I saw an interview with one of the children of the lesbian couple who testified in the Supreme Court, and she also lied, but she said she did not recommend allowing gay adoption, but in the court she testified favorably toward it because she didn't want to embarrass her mother, and her mother had treated her well, and she didn't want to make her mother look bad during the court case. So this is kind of a pattern with the ACLU. When you throw off one commandment, adultery and fornication and things like that, when you throw this off and declare it a right, what are your commandments? So people say, "Oh, you're trying to say atheists are not good people." Well, if a Christian does something that breaks, we can always throw the commandments at him. In other words, we have a standard. The Ten Commandments are the standard. We can argue about what they mean. But if a Christian violates one of these, we can jump on them, and then we have a standard in which to measure ourselves and to measure other people against. But so back to the idea of, can atheists be good? Well, what do you mean by good? The atheists have no commandments. They have nothing, no moral standard that's agreed upon by them to hold to. They try. They say, well, treat others as you want to be treated, or whatever the case might be, or sympathize with others. But they have no set of commandments. So if the ACLU believes that people should be allowed to marry the same gender, or whatever you're talking about, and they lie to get it, I don't know. There's really doesn't, to me, to seem like there's any way to hold them to accountable. So back to can the atheist be good? Well, what's your definition of good? That's my response to atheists. Well, what's your definition of good? Where are your commandments? You have nothing. You have no standards for us to hold you to. So if you violated the Christian commandment on adultery and fornication, you violated that, then of course you violate the commandment not to bear false testimony, which we have in each of these cases. These are just three examples, and I'm sure there's other interviews out there where similar things happen. So the point is, they lied in the Supreme Court in at least these three cases, and each of the things that they wanted the court to do were unbiblical, and they were contrary to commandments anyway. So there you go. They're consistent. So can atheists be good? Well, what do you mean by good? What do atheists say is good? So you have to answer that question before you can say whether atheists can be good or not. So anyway, her son, Madalyn Murray Harrow's son, William Murray, later grows up, gets converted, and says that he had not been. He lied. He perjured himself and said he'd been abused in the hallway by Christian students in the public school, and this is one of the reasons why you can't allow Christianity in school, because Christians treat people bad, and he wasn't. It's simple. Okay, so the net result so now what I want to do is kind of, you have a really, really sketchy history of this. So it is in full swing. It's been many, many years since 1961, and I don't know of any public schools that pray. When they do, it's student-led. There's an ongoing argument about it. Public schools are allowed to have prayer if the students lead it, and this again was a reaction to Madalyn Murray Harrow's thing. Now, Madalyn Murray Harrow ends up getting killed in a very mysterious circumstance and all that kind of thing. Anyway, we move on from her. Now, the question that I want you to pay attention to in this lecture is, why did they do this? What did this have to do with this whole movement that we're talking about? What is the overall goal of the political classes? And the goal of the political classes, we are seeing the result, and that is to remove all legal restrictions on sexual perversion. That's basically the goal. So now let's see how it works. I want you to pay attention how it works. The net result of having separation of church and state being a primary idea in the mind of the public, because everybody has it now. Everybody has it. I had a student in my own class in a Christian school, and we were talking about gay marriage, and the child said, well, Mr. Wooten, that's your religious position, and you can't impose your religion on other people. And my response was, well, there's nothing religious about it. The male member doesn't go in a rear end. I mean, a little blunt, but that's what I told him, because that's the idea. So what makes homosexual marriage religious? Is it because the Bible forbids it that it's religious? Well, the Bible forbids murder. So that means we can't have laws against murder because they're religious propositions. The Bible forbids stealing because it's in the Bible. Does that mean it's a religious proposition and therefore we can't have it in law? Well, of course not. That's absolutely absurd. Then why is the opposition to gay marriage and things of this nature, why is that a religious proposition? It's a biological proposition. The purpose of the sex drive is to create children. The purpose of having a marriage is to protect children and women because they're put at a disadvantage when they have to bear children and rear them. They're put at a serious disadvantage. And so marriage is to protect women and to protect children so they can live useful lives. That's the purpose of marriage. None of these things apply to a gay marriage, and therefore gay marriage is not a thing. It doesn't exist. Not because it does not fulfill any of those purposes of marriage. Now, you may have other personal reasons for getting married, but the government doesn't give a rip who you love. What business is it of the government's who you love? The government's business is to make sure people are taken care of and that society is well ordered so that the weak are protected. That's the purpose of government. And you being romantically attached to somebody has nothing to do with the government. What do they care? And of course, there's other issues. But all right, so the net result of this idea is that if you are a Christian, by definition, you cannot have your way in the government. Because any law based on a Christian proposition is an establishment of religion. Let me repeat that. Because the political classes have already named this in their favor. They have a word for this too. Again, a word to control your thoughts. They have a word for this, except they don't want it applied to this idea. So let me repeat the idea, and then I'll give you the word. You've heard it recently. The net result of this interpretation of the separation of church and state, the net result is that if you're a Christian, then by definition you cannot have your way in government, because any law based on a Christian proposition is an establishment of religion. You know what that is? It's called voter suppression. A certain class of people, Christians, may not have any say in the government unless they agree with non-Christian propositions. This is the result. Think about it. Genius, if you're on the opposition side. Absolute genius. Absolute genius. And even this young man, who I referred to earlier with the nasty response that I gave, even he fell for it. And I talk to Christians all the time. Oh, well, you can't oppose gay marriage because that's religious opposition and you can't establish religion. Oh, really? See, buy it. It's a genius. It's genius, absolute genius. Madeleine O'Hara started it. And of course, she wasn't the only one involved, but this is how separation of church and state is used. Okay, at this point, I'm going to stop. If we're out of time or if you have to leave, then you can come back to it later. I'm actually going to sit here and continue, but I'm going to break it here, and we're going to pick up room number 4 in our outline. So bye-bye, and some of you I'll see you in a minute.